She thought her dogs would silence him. But when they stopped at his feet, the truth started barking louder than hate ever could. In a town built on quiet prejudice, one man stood still and shattered everything. No punches, no rage, just presence. And the whole world watched. This isn't just a story about racism. It's about what happens when hate miscalculates who it's messing with. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Georgia heat hits different in the spring. Soft sun, bleeding through tall pines, cicadas just starting their whisper, and everything heavy with old stories. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, stood at the edge of his land, boots sunk slightly in the rich red clay, looking out across what was about to become something bigger than himself. To some, he was just a retired NBA legend, a millionaire who bought himself a piece of silence. But in this town, tucked between aging oaks and history-laden fences, Shaq had become something different. Not a man of noise, but one of gravity, a presence, a protector. The basketball court wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Just fresh asphalt poured clean, white lines staked straight, two rims ready to catch dreams. He'd insisted it be placed right near the front of his property, where the kids could see it from the street, where they could know it was for them, not hidden behind gates or approval forms. It wasn't about charity. It was about access, about belonging. Every day after sunrise, before the construction trucks rolled in and the electricians wired up the lights, Shaq would walk the land. Quietly, reflectively. It wasn't just a routine. It was ritual. He remembered when he was a boy, no more than 10, running on cracked sidewalks in Newark, ball in one hand, broken hopes in the other. He remembered the woman at the gas station who clutched her purse tighter when he walked past. He remembered being told not to smile too wide, not to wear a hoodie, not to talk too loud. He remembered being called names in front of teachers who said nothing. The wounds weren't fresh, but they had never truly scarred over. He had money now. Fame. He had his mother, Lucille, still strong, still praying for him every Sunday. He had children of his own, grown and blooming, but part of him, the core of him, still burned quietly with the pain of having to prove over and over that he wasn't a threat just because of the color of his skin. The neighborhood he lived in now wasn't poor. It wasn't violent. It was clean, polite, lined with manicured lawns and gated smiles. But make no mistake, it held its own kind of danger. Not in fists or weapons, but in looks. In HOA rules twisted just enough to keep certain people out. In conversations had behind closed doors with phrases like, keeping the community the way it's always been. Shaq had heard the whispers. Why's he here? What's he planning with that court? Is he gonna bring them into our neighborhood? He never responded. Never retaliated. That wasn't his way. Instead, he built, quietly, steadily, with intention. Because some people fight with fists. Others fight with foundation. Behind him, the court was taking shape. It wasn't just concrete and hoops. It was a statement. A promise. An open hand in a place where people were used to closed doors. The kids from a few streets over had already started drifting by on bikes, peeking through the temporary fences. He'd wave, sometimes toss a ball over. Let them shoot. Let them imagine. But not everyone appreciated the invitation. There was an unspoken hierarchy in the neighborhood, and at its peak sat a woman named Judith Calloway, widow. Inherited money, property lines long enough to touch 3 different zip codes. She lived 3 houses down from Shaq, in a colonial-style mansion she referred to as her family's legacy. She dressed in pastel suits and walked her 3 German shepherds every morning like she was leading a parade. Judith wasn't openly hostile. That wasn't her style. She smiled. She offered lemon bars. But under that sugar was the kind of steel that had kept neighborhoods segregated for generations. Judith didn't like the court. She didn't like the kids hanging around. She didn't like the noise, the energy, the change. And most of all, she didn't like Shaq pretending he belonged just because he could afford the land. At the last HOA meeting, she'd made a comment about preserving the neighborhood character. Another resident, Michael, mid-40s, always wore golf polos, followed it with, "We just don't want too much traffic, you know?" They all nodded, not directly at Shaq, but everyone knew who they meant. And what they meant. Shaq hadn't gone to the meeting, but Lucille had, and when she came back she'd placed a note on his kitchen counter. Some seeds grow better in storms. So he kept building, let the hammers speak, let the paint dry. What they didn't understand was that Shaq wasn't trying to change the neighborhood. He was trying to redeem it. Not with speeches, with spaces. A place where a kid could pick up a ball and dream louder than the whispers around him. As the sun climbed higher, the workers packed up for lunch. Shaq stayed, hands in pockets, gazing at the court. He could already see the games that would be played. The rivalries formed. The friendships started. He could see kids shooting into dusk, chasing light. He could even hear laughter echoing off the pavement that hadn't cooled yet. But he also felt something else. A shift in the wind. A ripple of something unsettled. It wasn't paranoia. It was experience. When you've spent your life walking the line between celebrated and suspected, you know when the air changes. Shaq wasn't afraid, but he was aware. And somewhere, in a house 3 doors down, a woman watched from behind linen curtains, her dogs at her feet, her hands holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, watching, waiting. The garden was growing, but not everyone wanted to see it bloom. Judith Calloway's house wasn't just a home, it was a statement. White brick trimmed with hunter green shutters, framed by 2 towering magnolia trees that had stood long before most of the town's newer residents had even been born. Her lawn was manicured with military precision. Every hedge clipped like it had something to prove. Wind chimes sang low from her porch, but there was no real melody to them. Just the sound of something delicate trying to mask something colder beneath. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, and she made sure everyone knew it. She hosted garden parties no one really enjoyed, kept records of every change on the block, and treated the homeowners association like a personal boardroom. People smiled when they saw her, but it was a smile trimmed with tension. You didn't cross Judith. Not unless you wanted your trash pickup mysteriously skipped or your fence violation mysteriously reported. She never raised her voice, never confronted anyone directly, but her power didn't need to be loud. It was woven into the neighborhood itself, like roots underneath a manicured lawn, subtle and suffocating. When Shaquille O'Neal moved in, Judith's world didn't just shift, it tilted. She'd read the headlines. She knew the man. But knowing a celebrity and accepting him as a neighbor were 2 different matters. She watched as the moving trucks came, as contractors rolled in, as the basketball court began to take shape. Her smile, as always, stayed in place. But behind the lace curtains, her eyes narrowed. Shaq was polite. He waved, sent over fresh cookies on Christmas, invited neighbors to walk the court once it was paved. Judith had declined every time. She preferred things stay simple. And Shaq, for all his fame and charm, was not simple. He was change. And Judith didn't tolerate change, not when it brought children from other parts of town, circling her cul-de-sac on bicycles. Not when it meant late afternoon echoes of basketballs, instead of birdsong. Not when it meant one man could shift the unspoken rules she'd spent decades reinforcing. Her resentment was never spoken aloud. That wasn't her style. She dressed it in silk blouses and Sunday smiles, but her intentions whispered in her actions. Anonymous letters to the HOA began circulating, citing concerns about public disturbance and property values, suggestions that perhaps larger gatherings needed permits, warnings about the growing presence of unfamiliar traffic. She never signed them, but everyone knew where they came from. When neighbors hesitated to agree, she pressed gently over coffee, reminding them how peaceful things used to be, how nice it was before all the noise. Judith had always known how to manipulate without appearing cruel. She didn't need to raise her voice. Just plant seeds of doubt, water them with tradition, and let them grow in the minds of those too afraid to push back. Her prize dogs, 3 massive German shepherds named Gunner, Blitz, and Valor, were always with her on morning walks. Their leashes taut, their eyes alert, they obeyed her like soldiers, trained to move at the slightest command. Most people thought it was impressive. Some found it unsettling. Judith called them her boys, and when she spoke to them, it wasn't with affection, it was with strategy, like she was preparing them for something. They were always leashed, always watching, but never far from her command. One morning, she stood at the edge of her lawn, watching Shaq help a group of local teens shoot free throws on the half-built court. He wasn't performing, just being present, laughing low, correcting a kid's form, offering up encouragement with that deep, comforting voice. Judith's grip on Blitz's leash tightened as she stared. Her smile stayed plastered, but her knuckles whitened. She turned away before anyone noticed, muttering something beneath her breath as the dogs bristled beside her. Later that afternoon, she drafted another letter, this one longer, more detailed. She referenced noise levels, safety concerns, potential risk factors. She included a suggestion for a security camera installation to protect our peace. She wrote with care, circling each word like a hawk, adjusting punctuation like a scalpel. Before sealing the envelope, she dabbed a touch of lavender oil on the paper. It was her way of making venom smell like perfume. Behind closed doors, she watched local news segments that reported on rising neighborhood tensions in other cities, nodding along like she already knew what was coming. She cut out headlines and clipped them to a corkboard in her laundry room. Urban influence causes spike in crime. Community friction rises after development projects. She never said the words aloud, but her fear was stitched between the lines. She wasn't afraid of Shaq the man. She was afraid of what he represented, of who he might invite, of what might come next. Her home, her rules, her reign. It was all being threatened by something she couldn't control. And Judith Calloway did not lose control. In her mind, she was preserving something good. She wasn't the villain. She was the last line of defense against chaos. She believed that deeply. She believed it when she trained her dogs to respond to certain voices, certain tones. She believed it when she left out HOA notices, just a little too visible in her neighbors' mailboxes. She believed it every time she heard a bounce of a basketball and felt something inside her coil. She didn't scream. She didn't storm. She plotted. And the dogs waited, always waiting. Gunner, Blitz, Valor. 3 names that sounded more like a plan than pets. They were never let off leash. Not yet. But the way she spoke to them, like she was preparing for battle, it was only a matter of time. Something was coming. And Judith, in her pressed linen and smiling malice, was ready for it. The morning started like joy often does, slow and golden. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees that lined the edge of Shaq's property, stretching long shadows over the grass, still cool with dew. It was the kind of day made for celebration. Speakers thumped with soul music, laughter danced in the breeze, and the smell of barbecue curled through the neighborhood like a promise. The ribbon cutting for the new community court had finally arrived, and Shaq had insisted on doing it the right way, not with ceremony, but with community. Children dashed between folding tables draped in red and white cloths, their plates piled high with ribs and sweet corn. Parents leaned back in lawn chairs, chatting with one another like old friends, even if they'd just met. Teenagers tested out the court, sneakers squeaking, balls thumping rhythmically against the new pavement. A local DJ worked his magic from under a pop-up tent, spinning tracks that mixed nostalgia with summer heat. It wasn't chaos, it was loud. And for once, the quiet suburb pulsed with real energy. Shaq moved through it all like a gentle giant. Laughing here, handing out cold water bottles there, wiping mustard off a toddler's cheek. He didn't make speeches. He didn't stand above the people. He moved among them, wide shoulders stooped so he could listen closer. Long arms reaching out to catch stray passes from young dreamers testing their form on his court. It was his space, but he didn't own it. He offered. Near the edge of the property, just as the music mellowed into something smooth and familiar, Shaq noticed a little boy, no older than 7, standing apart from the others, looking for someone. A single balloon clutched in one hand, the other rubbing nervously at his shirt hem. Shaq stepped over, crouched low and asked softly if he was all right. The boy nodded, and said his aunt had just parked down the road. Shaq smiled, offered his hand and said, "Let's go find her." The boy took it without hesitation. As they walked up the slight hill that separated the court from the street, the mood stayed warm, the laughter still rising behind them. But something shifted in the air. It was small at first. A hush in the trees, a tremor in the sunlight. Shaq felt it before he saw it. That prickling on the back of the neck that comes from being watched, not seen, targeted. They crested the hill, and there she was. Judith Calloway stood near the edge of her property, hair pulled tight, lips thinner than usual, and in each hand, 2 thick leashes. Gunner and Blitz. Valor trotted at her side, off leash, but not loose. Not yet. Her eyes were locked on Shaq and the boy beside him. Her smile, if you could call it that, was stretched and shaking. Her voice rang out across the quiet, but it wasn't the voice she used at HOA meetings. It was raw, unmasked. "You don't belong here," she screamed. The boy stiffened. Shaq instinctively moved in front of him, shielding him with one arm. Judith's voice cracked again, louder now. "You think you can turn this street into your circus? You think we're gonna let you ruin this place like you people ruin everything? It was like the sun flared too bright for a second. Shaq didn't respond. His body didn't flinch. His eyes stayed calm. He reached back, gently guiding the boy behind him. Around them, a silence began to spread. Slow at first, like a ripple before a storm. Judith's fingers unclipped the leashes. 3 clicks. Then release. Gunner. Blitz. Valor. Muscle and teeth in motion. They thundered across the grass, snarling, foam flying from their mouths as they barreled toward Shaq and the boy. Someone in the crowd screamed. A plate clattered to the ground. And yet somehow, time didn't rush. It stretched. Shaq didn't move. Not a step. He squared his shoulders, brought the boy close behind him, and stared straight ahead, his breath slow, measured. The dogs tore across the field, wild and unchained, and then they stopped. 5 feet away, Gunner lowered his head. Blitz whimpered, circling back. Valor barked once, then sat. All 3 dogs stared at Shaq with something closer to confusion than rage. Their bodies, once rigid and trained to attack, now trembled with hesitation. The boy behind Shaq peeked out, eyes wide, and from across the field, clicks, dozens of them, phones raised, cameras rolling, not staged, not filtered, just real, raw footage of a black man standing firm while trained animals disobeyed hate. Judith stood frozen, the empty leashes dangling from her hands. Her lips parted, but no words came. Behind her, the neighbors who had once nodded politely began to step back. Something had shattered. Not just her control, her image. Shaq didn't speak. He looked at the dogs, then back at Judith. He didn't need words. Everything had already been said. He turned, scooped up the little boy in his arms, and walked back down the hill, toward the music, toward the warmth, toward home. The moment didn't fade. It grew. By nightfall, the video had gone viral. Stand with Shaq trended across every platform. News anchors debated what it meant. Commentators dissected every frame. Some tried to spin it, to question what happened before the clip began. But the footage was clean. The truth was too loud to ignore. Judith tried to deny it. She claimed the dogs had simply broken loose, that Shaq had provoked them. But the neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. Her words, once powerful, now hung in the air like smoke, without fire. Shaq didn't do interviews. He didn't post a response. He went back to the court the next morning. Same routine, same walk. He swept the court himself, placed water coolers on the sidelines, and waited for the kids to come back. They did. More of them this time. From different streets, different neighborhoods. They didn't come for the story. They came because something about that moment told them they were safe here. That this court wasn't just a place to play, it was a place to be seen, to be respected. The court, once just pavement and paint, had become a line in the sand. And Judith, once the quiet puppeteer of the neighborhood, had crossed it. But Shaq? Shaq held it, with calm, with purpose, with something more powerful than hate, present. The footage didn't just go viral, it detonated. Within hours of the incident, the video of Shaq standing still as Judith's unleashed dogs halted inches away from him had raced through social media like wildfire. There were no edits, no music overlays, no commentary, just the raw sound of breath, growls, and a silence more deafening than any scream. On TikTok, people stitched the clip with tears in their eyes. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. The Shaq stands, the court moment, Judith unleashed. On Facebook, neighborhood groups debated furiously, some in defense, others in deep denial. Mainstream media followed quickly, parking news vans along the same street where Shaq used to wave at dog walkers and early joggers. Now reporters pushed microphones through the gates of his home. Some polite, others invasive, all of them hungry for a statement. Shaq didn't give one, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew silence sometimes echoes louder. Still, he watched. He read. He listened. And what he heard wasn't one voice. It was a war of narratives. There were those who called him a symbol of grace under fire. They pointed out the calmness, the restraint, the silent courage. A modern-day David, one article read, but his weapon was presence, not a stone. There were muralists, already sketching concepts, influencers crafting long captions about allyship and fear. School teachers asked students to write reflections on the video, and in a few churches across the South, pastors replaced sermons with replays of the clip. But not everyone saw a hero. Conservative commentators questioned the footage. "We don't know what happened before the video," they claimed. "Those dogs didn't attack, so maybe the threat wasn't real." Some spun the narrative entirely, suggesting Shaq had intentionally provoked Judith by building a public playground in a private community. Online trolls surfaced, stitching the clip with slurs and dog whistle phrases about property rights and reverse racism. Their voices were fewer but louder than necessary. Loud enough to divide. Outside Shaq's home, lines were being drawn, not by chalk, but by cars, cameras, and feet. Protesters gathered, some in support, holding signs like "Stand Tall, Big Shaq," and "Fear Didn't Flinch." Others, fewer in number but vicious in voice, blamed him for bringing chaos to a peaceful community. Police were called, barricades erected. Judith's house down the street became its own battleground. Activists chanted. Counter-protesters muttered insults behind sunglasses. She didn't appear at first. Her blinds stayed shut. Her lawn, once pristine, was now crowded by opinion. Inside his home, Shaq watched it all from behind glass. The same hands that had lifted championship trophies, now curled around a cup of black coffee, untouched. His mother, Lucille, paced the kitchen behind him, her worry tangible. She wasn't unfamiliar with tension. She'd lived through the 60s, raised her son with caution stitched into his very bones. But this was something more unpredictable, more exposed. "Lay low, baby," she told him that evening, gently. "Let the heat pass. You did right. Let the people say what they say, and let it go." Shaq nodded. He always nodded. But this time, it was just a surface agreement. Because beneath his stillness, something had started to turn. A slow gear, a patient flame. The next morning, instead of retreating, Shaq made calls. Quietly, methodically. He reached out to local youth centers, asking what they needed. He contacted civil rights attorneys he'd once met at charity events. He called community leaders from the other side of town, the ones who'd always been kept at a distance. He started coordinating resources, shelter donations, mental health support, media literacy seminars. Not for Judith, not even for himself, for the moment, for the movement it might become. Meanwhile, the legal storm began to gather. Judith finally surfaced, not on camera, but through a statement her attorney delivered to a packed press huddle outside the courthouse steps. Miss Calloway, the lawyer read, was deeply traumatized by the incident involving Mr. O'Neill. She feared for her life. She maintains that her dogs reacted instinctively to a perceived threat, and that Mr. O'Neill deliberately instigated a confrontation. The shock rippled fast. Judith had filed official charges, accusing Shaq of provoking her dogs and placing her in emotional and physical distress. The phrase echoed across social media, screenshotted, laughed at, but not dismiss, because once the legal process begins, even the absurd gets oxygen. Shaq received the paperwork in silence. He unfolded it slowly at the dining table, Lucille watching from across the room, her arms folded tight. He read each line. The accusations, the legal jargon, the implications. Then he folded it back and said, quietly, "So that's her next move." Lucille's voice cracked slightly. "You gonna fight it?" Shaq's eyes were steady, but something in his jaw flexed. "No," he said. "I'm gonna build something bigger than it." The court dates would come. The legal dance would play out. But Shaq wasn't going to let the narrative be hijacked by fear tactics. He had already begun to organize a public event, one not about protest but about purpose. A community roundtable. Outdoor. Open-minded. Inviting everyone in the neighborhood, supporters and critics alike, to listen, to speak, to confront what had been buried for too long beneath manicured lawns and polite nods. He didn't announce it online. No flashy flyers, just word of mouth, a ripple instead of a wave. And within days, RSVPs began rolling in from directions he hadn't expected. Young parents, retired teachers, local activists, even a few former police officers. They weren't coming for drama, they were coming for clarity. Judith, on the other hand, began to double down. Her legal team flooded local media with op-eds, describing her as a victim of online bullying. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now found themselves divided, some still attending her brunches, others crossing the street to avoid eye contact. Her leash on the narrative was slipping. But Judith had always been a strategist. And this charge, this legal play, it wasn't about winning in court. It was about stalling, about shifting light from what she had done to how she now claimed to feel. She wasn't denying the dogs had been released. She was reframing it. A woman cornered, a woman misunderstood, a woman defending her space. But the world had changed since she last held full control. People weren't just watching. They were remembering. Remembering every moment they'd been silenced, dismissed, underestimated. Remembering every neighbor who smiled in the daylight and whispered in the dark. Remembering the moment a man stood still and the beasts trained to harm him refused. Shaq didn't plan to wage war in the courtroom. He planned to wage clarity in the community. And as his next move began taking shape, not in anger, but in design, the world leaned in closer, breath held, waiting to see what a giant would do next. The folding chairs were already half filled when Shaq arrived at the Briarwood Community Center. A narrow building with dusty blinds and outdated carpeting. It hadn't hosted more than a bake sale in years. But tonight it was full to the seams with anxious eyes, upright spines, and that unmistakable charge in the air. The kind that arrives when truth and image are about to collide. The town council had labeled it a community conversation on safety and unity. But everyone knew the real reason. The incident. The video. The dogs. And the man who hadn't moved. Shaq had considered declining the invitation. He didn't need a microphone to prove who he was. But Lucille had placed a hand on his shoulder the night before, steady and quiet, and said, "Sometimes showing up is the loudest thing you can do." So he did. Shaq didn't dress for war. He wore a plain navy shirt, jeans, and his presence. When he walked in, conversation stopped. Some people nodded, some turned their heads, others froze mid-sentence. The mayor greeted him awkwardly, eyes darting between Shaq's face and the podium. Shaq gave a polite nod and took his seat in the third row, front and center, directly across from the long table where the HOA board and town council sat. At the far end, perched like a crow on a picket fence, sat Judith Calloway. She wore ivory, deliberately, a crisp blouse, pearl earrings, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. But it wasn't the outfit that drew the gasps. It was the purplish mark painted delicately along her cheekbone. A bruise, contrived, planted like a seed. And beside her sat her attorney, flanked by two well-dressed neighbors. Shaq had seen more times walking their dogs than attending any civic event. When the meeting began, the council chair, an older man named Halden, who rarely looked up from his notes, cleared his throat and welcomed everyone, reading from a stiff sheet of paper. "We're here to address recent tensions in our community and promote peaceful understanding moving forward." His voice was flat, his delivery uninspired. No one was here for unity platitudes. They wanted sides, and they wanted a victim. Judith was invited to speak first. She stepped forward, her posture composed, her tone carefully measured. "I have lived in this neighborhood for over 3 decades. I have welcomed new families, hosted events, served on boards. I never imagined I would one day be vilified in my own home." She touched her cheek lightly, as if on cue, the room quietly reacting. She described feeling threatened. She painted a picture of fear, of large crowds, loud music, unfamiliar faces. "It's not about race," she said. "It's about disruption, safety, decorum." But the words, no matter how polished, hung heavy, in the room like smoke from a fire. No one could unsee. And then she looked directly at Shaq. He may be a celebrity. He may be admired. But that doesn't give anyone the right to intimidate or create division in our community. Some heads nodded. Others remained still. Shaq's expression didn't change. He watched her the way a mountain watches a storm. Unshaken, unmoved, but fully aware of what it meant. The council chair turned to Shaq next. "Mr. O'Neill, if you'd like to respond." Shaq rose slowly. He didn't need to clear his throat or gather notes. His voice, when it came, was low but clear. "I came here for peace, not the kind that means silence, but the kind that means people feel safe being themselves." He glanced across the rows of neighbors. "I built that court because there were kids who needed a place to feel welcome. I didn't ask anyone to change. I just gave them space." He paused. Not dramatically. Just enough for the weight of the words to settle. "I didn't release any dogs. I didn't call anyone names. I stood still. That's all I did." He didn't defend himself beyond that. Because he didn't need to. The moment, the footage, the truth, it was already out there. But still, the room shifted uneasily. Judith's supporters had come prepared. One neighbor raised a concern about property values. Another mentioned increased foot traffic. A third brought up unintended consequences. The subtext screamed louder than their tones. The tide was beginning to lean, Not all the way, but enough to make the air tighter. And that's when he stood up. From the back of the room, near the exit doors, a man in a tan jacket, with salt and pepper stubble and calloused hands rose. No one had seen him enter. He wasn't on the list to speak, but he walked calmly to the front, as murmurs began to rise. "Name's Harvey Keene," he said, voice gravelly and steady. "Used to work for Judith Calloway. Did her dog training, yard work, security system." His eyes scanned the room, then settled on her, until about 6 months ago, when I quit, for reasons I wasn't planning to talk about tonight. But now I think I have to. Judith visibly stiffened. Her attorney whispered something sharp into her ear, but she didn't move. Couldn't. Harvey continued. "Those dogs, Gunner, Blitz, Valor, I trained him. And I'll be honest, I didn't like how I was told to do it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. "See, part of training involves testing dogs' responses to different environments. Judith asked me to use voice samples, angry yelling, laughter, different accents, said she wanted them trained to handle the unpredictable. But then she gave me specific audio clips that were only black voices, some off TV, some from recordings she made on her phone." Gasps scattered the room like dropped glass. "I object," Judith's attorney barked. But Harvey ignored him. "I didn't say anything at first. Thought maybe I was reading into it. But then she started rewarding the dogs when they growled at certain visitors. One time she had me play a video of a group of black kids skateboarding. And she kept clapping when the dogs barked at the screen. That's when I quit." He dropped the folder on the council table. "There's documentation, emails, audio logs, time-stamped videos. I didn't want to get involved, but when I saw her standing here, bruised up with lies, I knew it was time." Judith was pale. Her hands trembled slightly. The room was silent, breath held in collective suspension. Shaq didn't react. Not out of indifference, but out of knowing. This wasn't victory. This was exposure. There's a difference. The council called a brief recess. People spilled into the hallway, buzzing, arguing, re-evaluating everything they'd just witnessed. Shaq stepped outside into the cool night air. Lucille was already there, arms folded, watching the sky. She didn't say "I told you so." She just nodded toward the stars and said, "Truth don't always come dressed nice, but it shows up." Inside, the tide had turned. But Shaq wasn't celebrating. He was preparing. Because now that the truth was in the room, the real work was just beginning. The morning after the town hall wasn't loud. It was eerily quiet, as if the entire neighborhood had taken a collective breath and didn't quite know how to let it out. Wind ticked along the gutters of pristine roofs. Sprinklers spun in awkward rhythm. But no one watered lawns that day. The real mess wasn't in the yards. It was in the inboxes, the phones, the group chats, the unspoken alliances suddenly unraveling like loose thread. Shaq stood on the porch of his home, coffee steaming gently in his hand, staring at the sidewalk below like it might spell something out. His phone buzzed nonstop on the table behind him, but he wasn't rushing to answer. He already knew what was happening. The video clips from the town hall had made it online by dawn, but they weren't the only thing circling. Late the previous night, Harvey Keene had done more than testify. He had uploaded a digital archive of everything he'd held onto: email exchanges, time-stamped voice memos, security cam footage from Judith's property, and then the audio files. At first they sounded harmless. Dogs barking, trainers speaking, background static. But then came the looped commands: "Get him, go, go, protect the property," and under them, the unmistakable sound of young black boys laughing, distorted from a video playing on a screen somewhere in the distance. Then Judith's voice, calm, composed, issuing praise as her dogs snarled at the audio. It was chilling. Not cinematic, not sensationalized, just real, documented, impossible to misinterpret. Public opinion didn't just shift, it ricocheted. Overnight, hashtags that had been sparking on and off suddenly surged again. Kennel truths, justice for Shaq, Judith trained hate. Think pieces popped up from journalists who had once hedged their bets. Major networks ran the story across primetime. Radio hosts, influencers, community leaders. Everyone had an opinion now. But the most powerful reaction came not from celebrities or activists, but from ordinary people. Those who had been told their paranoia was overreaction, that their experiences were misunderstood, that the system wasn't broken, just complicated. Now those same people heard a woman in a mansion, training her dogs not just to obey, but to fear the sound of blackness itself. Judith Calloway's name, once printed on charity gala invitations and local scholarship plaques, became a case study in racial programming. She stayed inside, refusing interviews, her attorney issuing robotic statements about misrepresentation and doctored content. But the damage wasn't contained. Protesters began gathering again, this time silent, holding posters with printed waveforms of the audio files. A haunting tribute to sound as a weapon. Still, Shaq didn't comment. He didn't post. He didn't dance in the downfall of his neighbor. He worked. While the internet raged, Shaq met with civil rights lawyers in a small conference room downtown, just out of view. He listened more than he spoke, took notes, asked how systemic change really happens. Not the viral kind, but the kind that holds, that builds. He began funding bias training programs for local security companies, organizing mentorship meetups for youth with PTSD from racial encounters, and drafting plans for a new branch of his nonprofit. This one aimed at reconditioning aggressive animals and retraining owners on ethical, inclusive handling practices. But the more he did, the less celebratory it felt. One evening, he stood at the edge of the court, watching two kids shoot hoops as the sun slid behind them. Their joy was pure, their laughter untouched, and yet inside him, something weighed heavy. The truth had come out. Judith's darkness had been exposed. But instead of triumph, Shaq felt something closer to grief. He didn't grieve for Judith. He grieved for the years she had lived without being questioned, for the neighbors who had quietly suspected, but said nothing, for the kids who'd grown up near her house and didn't even realize why they were afraid of her dogs. He grieved for the fact that he had to prove his peace, that his calm had to go viral before anyone believed his threat was real. Lucille found him there. No words exchanged at first. She stood beside him, hands tucked in her sweater sleeves, eyes following the arc of the basketball as it bounced off the rim and landed softly on the court. "She's not the only one, you know," Lucille said after a while. "I know. You did good though. I didn't want it to be about me." Lucille looked at him then, gently but firmly. "It's not. It's about who comes next." In the days that followed, donations poured in to Shaq's foundation, but so did letters, long ones, handwritten, folded, and stamped by people who felt seen for the first time. One from a teenage boy in Ohio who'd been attacked by a neighbor's dog but was told he'd looked suspicious. Another from a retired black veteran in Texas who'd been denied housing because his service dog was deemed too aggressive for the neighborhood. Their stories weren't exactly his, but they all rhymed. Meanwhile, Judith's legal team began to fracture. Two of her longtime advisors withdrew. A quiet civil suit was filed against her by a former domestic worker who claimed emotional abuse and race-based intimidation. Every headline chipped away at the mask she'd worn for so long. But still, Shaq didn't show up to gloat. He wasn't chasing vengeance. He was managing aftermath. One night, he sat alone in his study, flipping through a journal he kept only for personal reflection. On a blank page, he wrote, "I didn't beat her. I exposed the system that let her believe she'd never have to answer." Then he closed it, exhaled, and turned off the light. The truth had broken through the kennel. But the deeper battle against the culture that allowed that kennel to be built was still unfolding, and Shaq, grounded as ever, was ready for the next chapter. The study always smelled like cedar and clean paper. It was the quietest room in the house, where sunlight came in wide and warm through the high windows but never loud enough to distract. Shaq sat at the edge of a leather chair built more for his frame than for decoration, feet flat on the hardwood floor, hands resting on a single worn notebook that he hadn't opened in years. The house was still. Outside, the world buzzed. Reporters still circled. Articles still surged. Some angry, some inspired. Donations came in. Interviews were requested. Legal proceedings crawled along. But none of that could drown out the ache that had begun building in his chest again. The ache he'd carried for decades, but learned to bury beneath discipline and community work, and years of letting the past stay quiet. Tonight, the ache had its own voice. So he listened. The notebook was thick but mostly empty. A few pages here and there scribbled with memories, sketches, one or two poems he never let anyone read. But wedged near the middle was a folded sheet, slightly yellowed, creased 3 times, with his handwriting across the front. "Dad." He unfolded it slowly, as if the words might crumble if rushed. The ink had faded a little, but the weight hadn't. It was dated 10 years ago, a night after a racial profiling incident that no one had filmed. No hashtags, no proof, just another invisible injury that healed without scar tissue, but never without memory. He read the letter in silence. Dear Dad, you once told me, being a big man meant learning how to make yourself small, when you have to. Smile when they're nervous. Lower your voice even if they're yelling. Offer your hands even if they're clutching their wallets. I didn't understand it when I was 12, thought you were trying to keep me weak. But now I get it, you were just trying to keep me alive. I stood in a parking lot tonight, while a man half my size called me a threat to my face. He kept his hand near his belt, like he was ready to prove something. All I did was exist in the same space as him, and that was too much. I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice, just stood still. But afterward I came home, and sat in my truck for 30 minutes, because my hands were shaking. I felt 15 again, and I wished you were here, because I don't know how many more times I can swallow this kind of quiet rage without it eating a hole in me. I keep building things, Dad. Courts, programs, spaces. I keep telling myself that one day it'll be enough to prove I belong here. But some days it feels like I'm just building fences they'll paint over. If you ever wondered whether the world got better after you left it, it didn't. Not all the way, maybe not even halfway. I don't know how to explain to my own son why his skin is seen as a warning, instead of a blessing. But I'll keep trying. He finished reading it, his thumb resting on the bottom edge of the page. For a long while he didn't move. The silence in the room felt sacred. Heavy, not empty. In that moment, Shaq considered something he hadn't said out loud. Not to Lucille, not even to himself. Leaving. Not just the neighborhood, but the fight, the effort, the expectation that he be both mountain and mirror, strong and soft. Always wise, always still. Maybe someone else could take the torch. Maybe it was okay to disappear quietly and let the momentum carry forward without him at the center. He leaned back, let the letter rest against his chest, eyes closed. The door creaked open behind him. Lucille didn't say anything right away. She stepped in the way she always did, unannounced, unafraid. She looked at the notebook, the letter, and then sat on the armrest of the chair like she had when he was a teenager too tall for her to cradle. Her hand brushed against his shoulder. "That the one you wrote to him?" she asked softly. He nodded. "You thinking about running?" Another nod, slower this time. Lucille leaned her head against his, her voice just above a whisper. "You built peace here. Not hope. Peace. That's different. Hope can vanish. Peace has to be guarded." Shaq's eyes stayed closed, but the tears welled anyway, not because he was broken, because he was still whole, even when it felt like pieces were scattering. "I'm tired, Ma." "I know, baby. I know." They sat like that for a while. No ticking clocks, no outside noise. Just mother and son, warrior and builder, breathing through a storm that hadn't yet passed. Eventually Lucille stood, smoothed the fabric of her cardigan, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned. "You want to leave? Fine. But remember, what you made here didn't just save kids. It saved grown folks too. Saved me. Every time I see that court, I see your heart laid out in concrete. You think you're alone in this? You're not. You never were." And then she was gone, leaving the door open behind her. Shaq looked at the letter once more, then folded it carefully, placing it back in the notebook. He didn't burn it. He didn't frame it. He just let it rest. Not forgotten. But finally, Judith Calloway's arrest didn't come with handcuffs on the front lawn or sirens echoing through the cul-de-sac. No dramatic scene. No spectacle. Just a pair of quiet officers in plain clothes, knocking on her front door, while the morning mist still clung to the hedges she once trimmed with obsessive care. She answered, wearing the same ivory blouse she'd worn to the town hall, her pearls still on, her posture still upright. But there was no mistaking it. Her era had ended. The charges were official: hate speech, reckless endangerment, and animal cruelty. They stemmed not just from her dog's weaponized training, but from the deep file of evidence that Harvey Keene and others had provided. Emails, audio clips, logs of threats sent anonymously to families of color in the neighborhood, and testimony from ex-employees who had long stayed silent out of fear, guilt, or sheer resignation. As the news spread, her supporters fell quiet. Even the most loyal among them, those who once nodded at her garden parties and praised her upkeep, began to distance themselves. They weren't just afraid of scandal, they were afraid of what else might come out. And come out it did. Within 48 hours, an investigation was launched into her estate's employment history. Records showed a 30-year pattern of discriminatory hiring, only one black domestic worker in 3 decades, fired after 2 weeks without cause. Others came forward recalling veiled threats, withheld wages, and rules like staying out of sight when guests were over. One former cook revealed that Judith had forbidden her from using the front door even when the back entrance flooded. Each story peeled back a layer. What began as an isolated incident of racial targeting had become a mirror reflecting systemic rot. Judith, once the neighborhood's unchallenged figurehead, was now the symbol of something far older and darker than one outburst. And still, Shaq stayed quiet. Not out of retreat, but out of principle. While pundits clamored for comment, while reporters begged for interviews, he declined every invitation to take a victory lap. "I'm not here to make someone smaller," he told a friend in private. "I'm here to make something bigger." So when the world expected a press conference, he delivered something else. Shaq rented out the same community center where the town hall had been held. The same room that once echoed with division, and turned it into something new. He cleared the chairs, removed the podium, and set up a large round table. No lights, no stage, just voices. He invited Judith's former house staff, most of whom had never spoken publicly. Quiet women who had cleaned her baseboards, walked her dogs, prepared her parties, men who fixed her gutters, and painted her walls. Their names weren't known, their stories hadn't trended, but Shaq knew the real wound didn't just live in what was shouted. It lived in what had always been silenced. They came hesitantly at first, nervous, uncertain, but one by one, they took their seats. Across from them sat counselors, educators, even a few local teenagers from the court project. There was no moderator, no script, just Shaq, sitting among them, listening. The event was recorded, but not streamed. Shaq hired a small documentary team, discreet, respectful, and made it clear, this was not for spectacle. This was for legacy. Each person spoke, not in anger, but in reflection. A former nanny talked about how Judith had her memorize the back roads so certain people wouldn't see who she worked for. A landscaper remembered being told not to speak when clients were over. One elderly woman, eyes wet but steady, spoke about working under Judith for 11 years, without ever once being invited to eat at the same table. Then, a shift. One of the teens, Jordan, a lanky 17-year-old with a nervous energy, asked softly, "What kept you working there?" The woman answered simply, "I needed to eat." There was no applause. Just silence, deep and resonant. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of acknowledgement. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. Dignity began to rebuild itself. Shaq didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence, like always, was enough. But when the session came to a close, he did stand and address the room. "We don't always get to pick the battles we're remembered for," he said. "But we can pick the legacy we leave when the dust settles. This right here, this is legacy." The footage, once edited, wasn't released with a hashtag or a trending challenge. It was quietly uploaded to the Foundation's website, with a simple title, "Voices from the House." Word spread slow but deep. Schools began using it in classrooms. Training organizations requested copies, and people who once felt invisible saw themselves, finally, not as footnotes but as storytellers. Meanwhile, Judith remained under house arrest while awaiting trial. Her estate, once an icon of tradition, sat behind drawn curtains and a for sale sign that no one dared to touch. She made no statements, granted no interviews. The woman who had once pulled strings behind the scenes now watched the town move on without her. But Shaq didn't just rise because Judith fell. He rose because he chose not to fall into the same cycle that created her. He turned hurt into action, silence into space, pain into platform. And in doing so, he redefined what it meant to win. There was no ribbon cutting this time, no crowds, no press junkets, just a morning mist rolling off the edge of a quiet field in the southern part of the city, where concrete still smelled new and the old wounds of the last few months hadn't yet dried. This wasn't a basketball court, and it wasn't part of any neighborhood. This was neutral ground, a new beginning shaped from everything that had been broken. Shaq stood beside a chain-link fence, watching a black and tan shepherd weave through a training exercise. It paused at a signal, then moved forward, calm and focused. Across the field, a young officer in a navy vest gave a low whistle, corrected his posture, and looked over at the trainer beside him. The trainer nodded, made a note, and moved on to the next dot. There were 7 in total that day: rescues, police units, shelter pets, and each one was there for the same reason: to be untrained, and then taught again. The nonprofit was called Second Signal, named after the way dogs, like people, could be conditioned to respond to fear, to threats, to programming they didn't even understand. Shaq didn't want to just rescue animals. He wanted to rebuild the relationship between how people saw each other and how those instincts were passed to the next generation. On 2 legs or 4, he'd partnered with psychologists, canine behaviorists, retired officers, and community counselors. The mission wasn't flashy, but it was powerful. Work with canine units to eliminate racial bias in tactical commands, retrain aggressive dogs from abusive homes, and rehabilitate how neighborhoods interacted with both animals and authority. Some rolled their eyes when the idea was first pitched. Too niche. Not enough ROI. Too political. But Shaq didn't build based on trends. He built from need, and this need ran deep. He didn't give speeches at the launch, just stood quietly at the back, watching a young black girl in braids gently stroke the ears of a trembling rescue pup who'd once been trained to attack voices that sounded like hers. The dog didn't flinch. It leaned in. That was the speech. Somewhere else in town, behind thick curtains and aging crown molding, Judith Calloway watched a news clip about Second Signal. It wasn't a headline, just a local segment played on loop late at night. Her face didn't show much. She didn't blink more than usual, but the tears gathered anyway. Stubborn and silent. No cameras. No audience. Just an old woman watching the very man she tried to destroy reshape the thing that undid her. She didn't apologize. Not publicly. She didn't release a statement. Didn't attend any events. Didn't write a check to the cause. And Shaq never asked her to. Because this was never about extracting an apology. It was about building something apology could never undo. The twist, though, the one no one saw coming, arrived quietly on a Tuesday morning, when Shaq pulled into the training center's gravel lot and saw a familiar last name on a volunteer intake form. Calloway. The handwriting was clean. The emergency contact was listed as an aunt named Judith. The first name was unfamiliar. Lena. Shaq didn't jump to conclusions. He never did. But later that day, he found her near the kennels, adjusting food bowls and humming softly to herself. Early 20s. Auburn hair. Sharp eyes. Not guarded, but aware. She introduced herself with a firm handshake. "I know the name probably stands out," she said, beating the question before he asked it. He nodded. Gave her space. "She raised me after my parents passed. But we don't share a lot of views." Shaq didn't push. Instead, he asked what made her want to volunteer. "I guess," she said, pausing as she watched one of the dogs curl into its bed. "I wanted to see if something that's been used to hurt can be used to heal instead." That was it. No grand confessions. No emotional purging. Just the simple decision to show up somewhere different than where she'd come from. Shaq didn't use her as a symbol. Didn't parade her story. He let her work. Quietly. She became one of the most consistent volunteers. Always early, always observant, always kind. Some days she helped in silence. Other days she asked thoughtful questions. Not about Judith, about change. The story of Judith Calloway became a backdrop now. Something people whispered about, referred to obliquely. That woman from the court story. But the city had moved on, not by forgetting but by focusing forward. And Shaq? Shaq never claimed forgiveness.
Not for Judith.
Not even for himself. Forgiveness, he'd come to realize, wasn't the finish line. It was a language, and not everyone spoke it the same way. Some asked for it, others couldn't, but change, real change, spoke loud enough on its own. So when a reporter later asked him if he forgave Judith, he answered without hesitation, "I don't think about forgiveness like that. I think about what I'm doing now, and what I hope others do next." No headlines captured that moment, but those who heard it felt the truth of it settle deep. There was no closure. But there was movement, and in a world so often stuck in the past, that was more than enough. The court looked different now, not because the paint had changed or the rims were newer, but because the air around it had shifted. What once felt like a test of tolerance had become something bigger than defense, bigger than resistance. It had become belonging. No warnings, no permit, just open gates, wide sunlight, and the sounds of sneakers, laughter, and unfiltered joy echoing through the same space that once held suspicion like a fence. It had taken months, more than most people would ever realize. And not just for the concrete to settle or the nets to hang straight, but for the town itself to breathe again, for the watchers to step forward, and the whisperers to fall silent, for people who once passed by with judgment or distance in their eyes, to now nod, not always with understanding but with acknowledgement, and for the children, most importantly, to stop looking over their shoulders and start playing like they'd never been watched in the first place. Shaq stood just off the half-court line, one foot resting on a ball, watching it all unfold with that quiet stillness that had defined him through everything. He wasn't the centerpiece anymore. The kids had taken over that role, crossing over, passing, shouting, falling and laughing with no need for permission. They belonged here, and they knew it. That to him was the win. Around the edge of the court, families had pulled out foldable chairs. Coolers sat half open, dripping condensation. Music played from someone's Bluetooth speaker. Stevie Wonder, smooth and breezy. It wasn't a formal event. No flyers had gone out. It was just happening. Because real community doesn't need a date on a calendar. It just shows up. Lucille stood near the corner of the court beneath the shade of a wide umbrella, arms crossed, head tilted, her church flats planted steady on the earth. She wore a soft white hat and carried that same worn purse she always had, though she didn't need it today. She wasn't here to prepare, just to witness. Shaq walked over, standing beside her in silence. For a long stretch they didn't speak. They just watched a group of kids, black, white, Latino, run full court like they'd known each other forever, as if race and past and conflict were somewhere else entirely, as if the sunlight had erased it all for just a few hours. Lucille finally broke the silence, not with analysis, not with praise, but with a sigh. One of those deep, old soul breaths that says more than most monologues ever could. "You did right," she said. Shaq didn't look at her, just nodded. Didn't feel like it sometimes. That's 'cause good don't always feel good. Sometimes it just stays steady. He glanced at her then, the edges of his mouth curling into the kind of smile you only give to someone who's seen your whole story. "They ever tell you how it ended?" Lucille looked up at him. "What, baby? The dogs?" She blinked slowly. "No, I guess not." Shaq's eyes wandered back to the court. They were put in a shelter. Evaluated. People wanted them put down. Said they were too dangerous. But the trainer said they weren't born that way. Said it was what they were taught. Lucille's voice softened. "Like people." "Exactly," he said. "Like people." A small girl, no more than 10, broke from the court mid-play and ran toward Shaq, arms wide, braids bouncing. He bent down to hug her without asking who she was or where she came from. Her joy was invitation enough. Behind her, 2 more kids followed, asking if he'd watch their shots. Shaq promised he would. They dashed back like they had a point to prove. Lucille chuckled. "Whole city's gonna be here by sunset." "They can come," Shaq said, "long as they bring peace." A few yards away, near the water station, Lena Calloway was handing out bottles with practiced ease. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She was just helping. A few of the older kids recognized her last name, but didn't say anything. Not out of fear, but out of choice. She had earned her place, not with explanation, but with consistency. Judith hadn't been seen since the final ruling. No jail time, but a permanent ban from owning animals and a list of court-mandated community service projects she had yet to complete. Her house sat unsold, her curtains drawn. Some speculated she watched the court from time to time through slits in the blinds. But Shaq didn't wonder. He didn't need to. What he cared about stood in front of him now. Movement. Not the political kind, the human kind. The sun had crested above the trees, casting long, even shadows across the court. Shaq walked toward the sideline, where the kids paused for water, his large figure now more familiar to them than famous. One boy offered him the ball. Shaq bounced it once, twice, then passed it back with a flick of the wrist and a grin. The boy took the shot, missed, laughed, and tried again. And in that single moment, beneath the sunlight, it was as if none of the pain had ever existed. But of course it had. Shaq felt it, still carried it. Every step on that court was a reminder, not of what had happened, but of what had not happened. No dogs had attacked, no punches had been thrown, no blood had been spilled. Just truth, standing still, refusing to back. Lucille walked up beside him, eyes squinting against the light. "You ever think about what could have gone different?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He watched a little girl sink a 3-pointer and get mobbed by her friends in celebration. Then he said, She let them dogs loose, thinking they'd bite. They didn't. Maybe some hearts still can change. Lucille reached for his hand. He took it. And as the camera of life panned back, no artificial fade, no orchestral swell, just real kids under real sky laughing in rhythm with their breath. The final image etched itself like scripture. A court in the sunlight. A people. Healing. And Shaq standing guard. Not in armor, but in love. If this story made you pause, question, or feel, don't let it end here. Talk about it. Share it. Build something in its spirit. Because change doesn't come from the loudest voices. It comes from the ones that won't stay silent anymore. The court is open. The next move is yours.